This is Narrative Elements Chapter 4b, continuing the discussion of character and characterization. So usually authors don't give all their characters equal attention. Some characters we get to know more deeply than others, or some might just be drawn in more detail in the first place, fleshed out more, we sometimes say. And there are some technical terms for describing the amount of depth or complexity or detail or lifelikeness that a character has. Two of the most common terms come from our old friend E.M. Forster. He described characters as flat if they were identified to the reader using just a few traits or notable characteristics, and round if they had a bunch of different aspects to them, including possibly some qualities or desires or motivations that might be in conflict with each other, just like they sometimes are in real life. I'm sure everybody knows at least one person in their own real life that struggles with the trade-offs that we have to balance out the very natural desire to be a reliable and loving spouse, for instance, with the also very natural desire to have a good time and get your own way. In real life, these trade-offs and priorities are not simple, and we all understand, at least ourselves, to be multidimensional beings. So in short stories, and even in a novel, the author might not have time to make every single character equally lifelike in that way. So we have rounder versus flatter characters. This is not a binary distinction, it's more like a continuum. And another useful contrast for readers is static versus dynamic characters. Basically, does the character undergo any change during the course of the narrative? If they do, they're dynamic. If they don't, they're static. E.M. Forster didn't invent that concept. I think that the idea of dynamic versus static predated E.M. Forster, but don't quote me on that. In any case, many people use the terms round and dynamic as though they were synonymous, but they're actually not. There's a tendency, certainly. Round characters tend to be dynamic, and dynamic characters tend to be round, but it's not a logical impossibility to have a static round character or a dynamic flat one. And I offer you, as an example of a dynamic flat character, the protagonist of Jack London's story, To Build a Fire. Okay? We don't know much about that guy at all, and we never do learn much. We don't know why he's in the Yukon or what his life plans are. What we do know is a handful of things only. You can count them on the fingers of one hand. We know that he's overconfident when he starts out alone in 75-degree weather. 75 degrees below zero weather. We know that he's mean to his dog. We know that he gets a little sneery about the old-timers back at the camp who he thinks are kind of wusses about the natural dangers that this environment presents, this extreme environment. The word he uses to describe these guys is womanish. And London tells us directly, using characterization technique number 5, that the man doesn't have much imagination. And that's it. That's all we ever learn about the man. We don't even ever have a name for him. And as soon as we meet the guy, we can size him up. And I find it easy to hang a particular label on him. If I had to describe him in 2 words, I would call him a macho jerk. And that's pretty much what a flat character is, one that it's easy to hang a label on. Now, my feelings do change as the story unfolds and I watch this character in action. I warm up to him a little bit as I see how tenacious he is in fighting for his life. I come to have more affection for him and a little bit more admiration, not a whole lot, but a little. It takes physical courage and determination to do some of the things that he does, like when he holds burning things in his mouth or in his bare hands, or wedged between his frozen wrists, rather. But he never becomes multidimensional. Jack London just never gave him any more than those few traits, and that's all he's got from the beginning to the end of the story. The dog has just as rich an internal life as this protagonist does. So he does not achieve roundness, but he's not completely static either. He makes one change in the course of the story, and a significant one from the perspective of the story. Before he dies, he does realize that it was a mistake to be overconfident like he was, and that the old-timers were right. So, To Build a Fire was published in 1908, and I actually don't think the same story in the same form would get published today, because I don't think that today you would get away with having such a flat protagonist. The expectations have changed for serious literary fiction. Critics and experienced readers now expect narratives to be centered on dynamic, round characters. So, fictional techniques and styles evolve just like they do in every field, and these days, character-driven fiction is considered superior to plot-driven fiction. Let's say that part of what we do when we're thinking our deepest thoughts, pondering our most important philosophical or spiritual values, part of what we're doing is thinking about what kind of people we want to be or ought to be, what kind of lives we should be leading. Well, literature addresses these questions too, through character. Which characters remind us of us? Which characters should we try to be like? And which ones should we take as negative examples, warning us what not to be like? So I think all readers and writers engage in this kind of moral evaluation of character, whether consciously or not. And I'm not saying it's the main motive for readers or writers, most of them anyway. But one of the side benefits of literature is that it can provide a moral education, can exercise your moral imagination. Now, incidentally, not everybody agrees with me about that. Some writers and critics say that if they were interested in morals, they would have gone into theology, not literature. And some people have the slogan, art for art's sake. In the mid to late 20th century, that view was very popular, that aesthetic values should be our primary concern in appreciating literature. So it became popular at a particular point in history, and now it's kind of gone out of fashion again. Morals are back in, although it's not usually put in those terms. It's more often spoken of in terms of marginalization and oppression and things like that. So because things change and because not everybody has the same literary values, let me be crystal clear that I'm going to talk now for a minute about my own personal literary values. But you should keep it in mind, since I'm the person that will be grading your short stories if you're a creative writer, and your essays if you're a literature student. If you're in a literature class, I expect you to be able to say more about character than just who you rooted for, who you approve of or disapprove of. Okay? Your task here is to do something more than just going through and sorting people out into bins labeled good and evil. Good versus evil is kind of the ultimate flattening out of character. It reduces people to just one trait. And when an author has taken the trouble to create round characters, flattening them out in that way is very disrespectful of the writer's work. So, if you're in a creative writing class, I expect you to be striving to achieve psychological realism. I realize that you may have other motives. Like Jack London, you may have some writerly purpose where you're setting up characters primarily to be a lesson of some kind for the reader. But if the character you create is not at all lifelike, it's nothing like a real person, what use can it really be to help the reader's moral development? I mean, who's ever going to recognize themselves as being like the wicked stepsisters, for instance, in any significant way? Now, that doesn't mean that I think there's no such thing as evil, or that writers shouldn't address evil. I just think that evil people in real life are round, very round. And therefore, if your goal is to fight for good and combat evil, if you want to be able to cope with evil when you encounter it in your life and avoid being evil yourself, I urge you to seek out the kind of literature that has plenty of round characters in it, and write that kind too. Here's some final advice. As I said, character is a very good source for writing excellent literature papers. If you're writing a character analysis, remember that you should include the details of characterization that you have combed through and found in the text itself. So your impressions or final conclusions about a character, they may be exactly right, but part of the value here is making the interpretation itself. So this is the equivalent of, in math class, of showing your work, not just showing the final answer. What brought you to these conclusions about this character? Another thing, many papers have to be given average grades at best because the thesis is insufficiently complicated for college-level writing. Here's a tip for writing a sufficiently complex, for creating a sufficiently complex thesis. One way to do that is to take a step backward. Step out of the diegetic universe of the story and into the mind of the author. Of course, this is speculative, but there is an author behind these characters. The characters aren't the same as people. They were created by an author out of a lot of little characterization decisions that the author made for some artistic reason or other. And if you try to probe backward and find the author's reasons, then you're automatically on a higher plane of analysis than if you're just reacting to the characters. Now, another thing to remember, you don't have to go along with the author. The author may not have at all the same values that you do, and that's okay. Yes, I believe literature can provide a moral education, but this is a very individual and private process, and I'm not here to get you to accept particular values. I'm here to train you in literary interpretation. Frequently, I find myself resisting some of an author's value judgments, and it's fine for you to do that too. What's not fine is to just impose your values on the author. You can reject the author's values, that's fine. You can debate the author and his or her values, that's fine. But you can't pretend that the author is the same as you. That's not so fine. One of my favorite sayings in class is keep the voices separate. So there can be a whole lot of different voices and values competing as we work our way through a narrative. There are different characters in conflict. They don't all value the same things. And then there's what we can guess about the author's own opinions if they don't speak directly, which they usually don't. And there may be a character within the narrative that speaks for the author more or less, but often there isn't. You know, often the author's position has to be triangulated in a certain amount of guesswork, interpretation, from what is in the story. And then there's what we can guess from internal evidence in the story about the setting of that story and what appear to be the widely held or generally held social values of that time and place. Or the time at which the author wrote the story, which may not be identical to the setting. And there, of course, we can work not just with guesswork and internal clues, but also, if we care to, we can do some library research about the time and place the author came from. And then, of course, we, the reader, the individual, have our own values and philosophical outlook. And then, of course, there are all the competing values and interest groups of our own time and place, which again may not be identical to the author's if it's a story of some while ago. So all of these different voices and tendencies have to be kept distinct. Don't let them go blurring together. Final slide. If you're a creative writer, there are a couple of exceptions to the idea that characters have to be your central focus. There are some kinds of serious literature out there that focus instead on something else. And I have put a couple of examples on this slide: allegory, fabulism, metafiction, and so forth. There may be some others that I haven't remembered to include. If you're interested in doing that kind of writing, you go for it. You probably have already read stories of this kind and you have models in mind. You probably already have studied up your Borges or your Barth or whoever it is that you admire, Bartlemy. I don't forbid experimentation, and even genre hopping is all right. Readers of what's called genre fiction, science fiction, horror, techno-thrillers, or basically anything that would have its own special shelf on the bookstore. Readers of this kind of book, they often know what they're looking for, and it's not necessarily character-driven narrative. They may be willing to settle for a lot less in the way of psychologically realistic, fully developed round characters than readers of mainstream literary fiction are, because they've turned to their preferred genre for other reasons. But nothing prevents you, even if you intend to write genre fiction, nothing prevents you from having wonderful characters on top of it. You can have great character development in any kind of story, and if you can do that, you'll have a superior product. Okay, 2 more pieces of advice. In real life, we despise people that are users, who every interaction they have with us, it's obvious that they're thinking, how can I get something out of this? How can I use this person as a stepping stone to my own goals? Well, characters are something like people. They're model people. So you shouldn't treat them that way either. You should care about them as individuals, not just what you can get out of them in terms of how they can further your plot or your theme. Finally, try to use a wide variety of different characterization techniques. You want to be especially cautious about overusing technique number 5, where the narrator directly tells the reader what to think. That can get pretty old for a reader, being told what to think. Give them some space too, to participate in the interpretive work, to collaborate with you on making the story or novel real in their own minds. This concludes Chapter 4 of Narrative Elements. See you next time.